How has your day been so far? Hello, we're AETA Stories, and today we're sharing a brand new original story with you.
Catherine Carter stood near the long wooden counter of the small bakery on the east side of Madison, Wisconsin, listening as her coworkers finished arranging a modest cake. It wasn't elaborate. No glittering tiers, no dramatic flourishes. Just a simple design, carefully made, with the number 15 piped neatly across the top. 15 years. That was how long Catherine had worked here, arriving before sunrise, leaving long after the ovens cooled, shaping dough and sugar into something that made other people's days a little lighter. Someone cleared their throat, and then the room filled with warm, uneven applause. A few smiles broke into laughter. A bouquet of chrysanthemums was placed into her hands. Catherine thanked them quietly, her voice steady, her smile restrained but genuine. She wasn't someone who needed attention. She had never been. To the people around her, Catherine was dependable in a way that rarely demanded notice. She showed up. She listened. She fixed mistakes without assigning blame. Over the years, the bakery had grown busier, more visible in the neighborhood, but her habits never changed. She worked with the same care she always had, as if every morning mattered just as much as the first. As her coworkers spoke about early mornings and long holidays spent together, Catherine's thoughts drifted back to a very different time. 15 years earlier, she had stood on a graduation stage, her name announced among the top of her class. Professors had shaken her hand. Representatives from large companies had offered interviews. Internships, promises of fast advancement in distant cities. Her future had seemed clear to everyone else. Everyone except Catherine. Instead of packing her bags, she had returned to Madison. She remembered the look on her mother's face when she announced her decision. It wasn't anger at first. It was disbelief, followed quickly by disappointment that hardened into something heavier. Her mother spoke of wasted potential, of sacrifices made, of how people would talk. Each conversation carried a weight, subtle at times, suffocating at others. Tears appeared at convenient moments. Headaches became emergencies. Silence became punishment. Catherine had listened. She had absorbed every word, but she had not changed her mind. What ultimately shifted the balance were the voices that spoke less often but with greater certainty. Her father had sat across from her at the kitchen table one evening. His tone calm, his gaze steady. He told her that a life chosen to impress others rarely belonged to the person living it. Her grandparents had agreed, their support quiet but unshakable. They reminded her that work done with purpose carried dignity, no matter how small it looked from the outside. With that, Catherine made her choice and did not look back. The bakery had not been glamorous. In the beginning, it was little more than a narrow space with aging equipment and uncertain foot traffic. She had started at the lowest position, learning routines, cleaning surfaces, following instructions. Yet something about the rhythm of the work settled her. The early hours, the repetition, the focus required to get things right. Over time, responsibility found her naturally, then trust, then respect. Years passed. The bakery became known beyond the neighborhood. Catherine moved from assistant to lead, and later into a quiet leadership role that suited her. She trained others patiently. She shared credit freely. Conflicts rarely lingered around her, not because she avoided them, but because she handled them without ego. Standing there now, cake cooling on the counter behind her, Catherine felt no need to justify the path she had taken. She had built a life measured not by titles or distance traveled, but by steadiness, by the knowledge that each day she had chosen where she stood. And that choice, made once and honored every morning since, had shaped everything that followed. Brian Carter had always known where he wanted to go. He spoke in plans and timelines, in promotions not yet earned and doors not yet opened. From the beginning, his ambition shaped the way he moved through the world, efficient, forward-facing, rarely pausing to consider what was left behind. To outsiders, he appeared disciplined and reliable. To Catherine, he often felt distant, as if part of him were always already somewhere else. They met during a period when Catherine's life seemed steady and predictable. Brian admired that steadiness, or at least the way it reflected on him. She was accomplished, well-regarded, uncontroversial. She fit easily into the image he was building for himself. When he proposed, the gesture was neat and timely, as though it had been penciled into a schedule and checked off. In the weeks before the wedding, Catherine's grandmother watched quietly. She did not criticize or interfere. She simply asked questions that lingered longer than they should have. Whether Catherine felt heard, whether she felt safe, whether silence ever felt heavier than disagreement. Catherine answered politely, brushing the questions aside. She told herself that caution was simply her grandmother's nature, that not every love announced itself loudly. On the morning of the ceremony, her grandmother held her hands for a moment longer than necessary. Her voice was gentle, almost hesitant, as she reminded Catherine that peace was not the same as absence of conflict. Catherine smiled, kissed her cheek, and turned away. There were guests waiting. There was a life to begin. The marriage settled quickly into routine. They shared an apartment. They hosted dinners when it suited Brian's professional image. Friends described them as stable, reliable. Catherine handled the domestic details without complaint, fitting herself around Brian's schedule with practiced ease. He worked late often, traveled when needed, and spoke of his career as if it were a living thing that required constant attention. Children were discussed only in vague terms. Brian always found a reason to postpone the conversation. First, there were promotions to secure, then financial milestones, then timing that never seemed right. Catherine listened and nodded, telling herself that patience was reasonable, that not every life followed the same rhythm. What she could not explain, at least not at first, was the growing sense of distance. Brian rarely asked questions that went beyond logistics. He noticed outcomes, not effort. When Catherine spoke about her work, he responded with polite approval but little curiosity. There was no cruelty in him, no overt hostility, just a persistent absence that made her feel alone even when he sat across from her. Gradually, her body began to change. At first, it was easy to dismiss. Long days, early mornings, fatigue that sleep did not fully cure. Then came the dizziness, brief moments when the room tilted unexpectedly. There were days when her limbs felt heavy, her head clouded, her focus slipping without warning. She told no one. She adjusted as she always had. Brian noticed her slowing only insofar as it disrupted routine. He suggested vitamins, less stress, better planning. His concern was practical, detached from urgency. Catherine nodded, grateful in a distant way that he did not press further. She was not ready to speak the worry aloud. The symptoms persisted. They grew harder to ignore. There were mornings when she had to steady herself before standing, afternoons when pain surfaced without a clear source. Catherine began to feel as though something beneath the surface was shifting, something she could neither see nor control. One evening, standing alone in the quiet of the apartment, she recognized a familiar feeling, the same one she had known years earlier, when she chose her own path despite pressure and doubt. It was the sense that waiting would only make the cost higher. The next day, she scheduled a medical appointment. She did not tell Brian until afterward, presenting the decision as a simple precaution. Inside, though, she felt a deeper certainty. Whatever was happening, it was no longer something she could carry alone. As she left the clinic with a list of tests and instructions, Catherine felt the unease settle fully into place. Not panic, not fear yet, just the understanding that the life she had been living, careful and contained, was about to be tested in ways she could not yet imagine. The test stretched over 2 long days. Blood draws at dawn, imaging in windowless rooms, waiting on plastic chairs that felt harder with each passing hour. Catherine moved from department to department inside the local hospital in Madison, following instructions, answering the same questions again and again. Dates, symptoms, family history. By the end of the second day, exhaustion pressed down on her so heavily that she struggled to keep her thoughts clear. When she was finally called back into the consultation room, the oncologist was already seated behind the desk. He was older, his white coat worn thin at the cuffs, his eyes rimmed with red as though sleep had become optional long ago. He flipped through her file slowly, reading and rereading numbers that meant nothing to her yet. At last he looked up. He did not soften his voice. He did not circle the truth. He spoke the way someone did when repetition had dulled the weight of words. Catherine listened as he explained that her results were consistent with a rare and aggressive blood cancer, one with limited treatment options, one with outcomes that were, in his words, extremely unfavorable. He told her that remission, in cases like hers, was statistically improbable. That time, not cure, was the focus. The room seemed to tilt. Heat rushed through her body, followed by a sudden hollow cold. The chair beneath her shifted as though it were no longer anchored to the floor. She tried to speak, but her mouth would not respond. The last thing she registered was the edge of the desk moving too close, then darkness, when awareness returned. She was lying on the examination table. A nurse stood nearby, her hand steady at Catherine's wrist. Someone had raised her legs. Someone had loosened her collar. The nurse's voice was calm and practiced, explaining that her blood pressure had spiked, that she had fainted, that she needed to stay still. The oncologist resumed speaking once Catherine could sit upright again. He answered her questions briefly. No known family history did not rule this out. No obvious exposure did not change the picture. The diagnosis stood. He would arrange immediate admission, further evaluation, supportive care. He spoke of steps to take while making it clear that none of them promised relief from the outcome he had already described. Within hours, Catherine was settled into a hospital room. The quiet there felt heavier than the noise of the corridors. She stared at the pale walls, the steady blinking of monitors, the narrow bed that now marked a boundary she had not expected to cross. She called her mother first. The words came out unevenly, breaking where she did not intend them to. Her mother arrived quickly, eyes red, hands shaking as she tried to offer comfort. She smoothed Catherine's hair, spoke of faith and hope, clung to reassurances she did not fully believe herself. Then Catherine called Brian. He arrived later. His steps were measured, his expression controlled. He stood at the foot of the bed, taking in the room, the equipment, the pale look on her face. He did not reach for her hand. He did not sit. He spoke after a pause, his tone low and precise. He said he had already looked into the diagnosis, that he understood what it meant, that he needed to be honest. He told her he was not prepared to be married to someone who was sick, dependent, or dying, that he had worked too hard to build his life, to dismantle it now. Catherine watched him as if from a distance. Each word landed with sharp clarity. Brian went on. He said he would not sacrifice his future, his finances, or his career for an outcome that was already decided. He said he would not take on medical responsibility or long-term care. Then, without raising his voice, he explained that a divorce would require dividing property acquired during the marriage. He did not want that. He reached for his hand and removed his wedding ring. The sound it made as it struck the bedside table echoed in the room. He told her he would wait, that when she died the legal process would be simpler, that her parents could manage the arrangements. He said this as if discussing logistics, not a human life. Catherine's mother tried to speak, but no words came. The room felt suspended, frozen between disbelief and reality. Brian did not linger. He adjusted his jacket, turned and walked out. He did not look back. The door closed softly behind him, sealing the absence he left in its wake. Catherine lay still, staring at the ceiling. The betrayal did not come as a sudden explosion, but as a quiet collapse from within. The life she thought she knew fractured in an instant. What remained was not fear of death, but the hollow realization that the person she trusted most had already left her to face it alone. Catherine was not alone in the room. She noticed it only after the first night passed, after the steady beeping of machines became background noise and the weight of exhaustion dulled the sharpest edges of fear. The second bed, separated by a thin curtain, was occupied by an older woman who sat upright most of the time, reading or staring quietly out the narrow window. Her name was Ruth Miller. She introduced herself without ceremony, her voice low and even, as though they were seated side by side in a waiting room rather than sharing a hospital ward. There was no pity in her eyes when she looked at Catherine, no sympathy that demanded a response. She asked simple questions instead: how long she had worked, where she was from, what she did before the hospital. Ruth did not speak of illness unless necessary. She did not offer reassurances or platitudes. When Catherine's mother visited and cried softly at the bedside, Ruth pretended not to notice. When the room grew heavy with silence, she filled it not with comfort, but with normalcy. One afternoon, as Catherine struggled to sit upright without dizziness, Ruth glanced over and asked what she did for a living. Catherine hesitated before answering. Saying it aloud felt almost dishonest now, as if claiming a life that had already been taken from her. But the word came anyway. She said she worked in a bakery. She said she had been there for a long time. Ruth's eyes sharpened with interest. Not the polite curiosity Catherine was used to, but something more alert. Ruth asked what kind of bakery, what Catherine specialized in, how she handled temperature changes, fermentation, balance. The questions came quickly, precise and informed. Catherine answered without thinking, falling into familiar patterns. For the first time since the diagnosis, she felt herself focus without effort. Ruth smiled then, not warmly, not kindly, but with recognition. She said she had spent over 20 years as a head chef before retiring, that she had trained people who went on to run kitchens of their own, that she knew the difference between following recipes and understanding food. Catherine listened, surprised at how the woman spoke, without pride or exaggeration. Just fact. The next evening, Ruth asked if Catherine wanted to learn something. It sounded absurd at first. They were in a hospital. Catherine could barely finish a meal. But Ruth insisted, explaining techniques verbally, breaking them down into concepts rather than instructions. Heat control, texture, timing, how food should feel, not just look. Catherine found herself listening intently, imagining movements, recalling scents and sounds. Hours passed without her noticing. Over the following days, these conversations became routine. Ruth taught, Catherine absorbed. There was no pressure to remember everything, no expectation of performance. The lessons were quiet, deliberate, almost meditative. They spoke of dishes Catherine had never made, of methods she had only read about, of mistakes Ruth had learned from decades earlier. Something inside Catherine shifted. The days were still hard. Her body remained weak. Fear lingered at the edges of her thoughts. But when Ruth spoke, Catherine felt herself step briefly outside the confines of the room. The world expanded again, if only in her mind. One evening, while Ruth slept, Catherine noticed a thin notebook lying open on the bedside table. It was old, the paper yellowed, the handwriting dense and slanted. She did not intend to read it, but one page lay folded back, a single paragraph visible. It was not a recipe. It read like a fragment of memory. Ruth had written about hiding something important in her apartment years earlier, during a time of upheaval. A cache she had created carefully, disguising it so thoroughly that even those closest to her would never find it by accident. There was no mention of what it contained, only the urgency of keeping it safe. Catherine closed the notebook gently and did not mention it. The next morning, Ruth watched her closely as she spoke, her gaze thoughtful. She said nothing about the note. She simply resumed their conversation as if nothing had been discovered. For Catherine, the effect was profound. In a place defined by endings, she had found a beginning. Not loud, not dramatic, just a quiet return to something essential. Through Ruth's presence, Catherine was learning again. And in learning, she was waking up. Ruth noticed the inconsistencies before Catherine did. It was not a single moment, but a series of small observations that refused to align with what the doctors had declared inevitable. Catherine slept without the restlessness Ruth had seen in terminal patients. Her appetite, though reduced, returned in quiet waves. Her focus sharpened during their conversations instead of fading. Even her blood pressure stabilized faster than expected. One afternoon, after a long stretch of silence, Ruth spoke plainly. She said that Catherine did not behave like someone at the end of life. There was no tremor in her voice, no dramatic emphasis, just certainty. Formed from years spent watching bodies fail and recover in professional kitchens and hospital corridors alike. Ruth had seen sickness. She had also seen error. Catherine listened without hope, only mild confusion. The diagnosis had been delivered with authority. It had come with numbers and terms she could not challenge. Yet Ruth persisted. She said that medicine, like cooking, was shaped by both skill and limitation. That mistakes happened. That first impressions were not always final truths. That evening, Ruth made a call. She contacted an old acquaintance, a hematologist who worked at a specialized oncology center several hours away. A man known for caution rather than certainty. She did not embellish. She did not argue. She simply asked if he would look at Catherine's file. The response came quickly. He agreed to review everything. Within days, arrangements were made. Catherine was transferred for a comprehensive second evaluation. The process was thorough and unhurried. New blood work, advanced imaging, genetic markers, viral panels. Specialists spoke to one another behind closed doors, their conversations deliberate rather than rushed. Catherine waited. For the first time since entering the hospital, she waited without dread. When the lead physician finally sat across from her, his posture was different from the first oncologist's. He did not speak immediately. He studied her face, then her file, then spoke carefully, as if choosing words that would alter the course of a life. He told her that the original diagnosis was incorrect. What she had was a rare viral condition that mimicked the clinical presentation of aggressive blood cancer. The markers overlapped. The symptoms aligned closely enough to mislead. But the disease followed a different path. One that could be treated. One that did not carry a death sentence. The words reached her slowly. Catherine did not cry at first. She simply sat still, absorbing the sound of them. Treatable, recoverable, temporary. The physician apologized formally. On behalf of the medical team, the hospital acknowledged the error. Documentation was corrected. New protocols were set in motion. Treatment began almost immediately. The days that followed were difficult, but purposeful. Medication brought side effects, but also progress. Strength returned in increments so small they were easy to miss unless one paid close attention. Ruth did. She marked each improvement silently, nodding as though confirming something she had known all along. Weeks passed. Catherine was discharged with instructions and follow-up appointments. She did not return to her apartment. There was nothing there for her now. Instead, she went to her parents' home, stepping back into a familiar space with a body still learning how to trust itself again. It was there that she learned the rest. Her position at the bakery was gone, terminated for medical reasons. Her employer had been informed that she was terminally ill, that her return was impossible, that arrangements were already being made. The message had come from Brian. He had spoken calmly, convincingly, leaving no room for doubt. Her belongings had also been removed from the apartment, boxed and delivered without discussion. The lease, she was told, remained in Brian's name. The decision had already been executed. Catherine listened as the information was relayed. She asked no questions. She made no calls. The clarity that followed surprised even her. She understood, then, that the life she had known was not something to reclaim. It had already been dismantled, piece by piece, without her presence. There would be no confrontation, no explanations demanded, no announcements made. She chose silence. Catherine informed only those who needed to know that she was alive and recovering. To the rest of the world, she allowed the assumption to stand. It was not spite that guided her decision, but certainty. The past had shown her exactly where she did not belong. As she rested in her childhood bedroom, sunlight spilling across familiar walls, Catherine felt the separation complete itself. She was not returning to who she had been. She was stepping into a life stripped of illusions, anchored instead by truth. She had survived not just illness, but the collapse of a future that was never built for her. And in that survival, she found something steadier than anger. She found freedom. Catherine began with short walks. At first, they were measured and cautious, limited to a few blocks around her parents' neighborhood. She learned to listen to her body again, to recognize the difference between weakness and recovery. Some mornings she returned home breathless, legs trembling. Other days, she felt steadier, surprised by how quickly the air filled her lungs. As the weeks passed, her routes lengthened. She gravitated toward the city park, not far from downtown Madison, a place where paths curved gently around trees and water, where movement felt optional rather than required. She walked without headphones, letting the ordinary sounds of life reach her. Footsteps on gravel, distant laughter, wind in the branches. One afternoon, she heard frantic yelping. The sound came from a cluster of low bushes near the edge of the path. Catherine slowed, scanning the ground until she saw a man standing several steps away, shifting his weight awkwardly, clearly unsure of what to do. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a certain self-consciousness, as if his body did not always cooperate with his intentions. A small puppy was tangled in the branches, whimpering softly. The man knelt, then straightened again, breathing harder than the effort seemed to warrant. He tried to reach in, withdrew his hand, and muttered something under his breath. When he noticed Catherine approaching, his expression flickered with embarrassment. She offered help without hesitation. They worked together instinctively. Catherine parted the branches while he steadied them, holding them back just enough for her to reach inside. The puppy squirmed, frightened but unharmed. Moments later, it was free, cradled against Catherine's chest, its small heart beating rapidly beneath her hand. The man exhaled a laugh that sounded more like relief than humor. He introduced himself as Jacob Miller. His voice was gentle, his manner unguarded. He thanked Catherine with a sincerity that did not overreach. There was no awkwardness beyond the natural sort that came with strangers meeting unexpectedly. No assessment, no curiosity disguised as charm. They talked as the puppy calmed. Jacob explained that he worked in technology, running a small startup with a handful of people. He spoke about it without boasting, describing long hours and shared meals eaten at desks. Catherine mentioned her background in baking almost apologetically at first, until she realized he was listening with genuine interest. There was no judgment in his questions, only curiosity. Before they parted, Jacob hesitated, then asked if she would consider cooking for his team sometime. He said they were exhausted, living on takeout and convenience. He smiled as he admitted it, aware of how small the request sounded. Catherine surprised herself by agreeing. She told him she would need to pace herself. He accepted that without comment. offering flexibility instead of pressure. They exchanged contact information, the interaction ending without expectation or pretense. When Catherine walked home, she realized she was smiling. Cooking for the team required preparation, but it also brought clarity. She drew on everything Ruth had taught her, not just techniques, but intention. Food as nourishment, not display. She planned meals that balanced flavor with care, remembering Ruth's emphasis on understanding rather than impressing. The first day she arrived at the startup office, she was greeted with polite uncertainty that quickly softened into appreciation. The team ate slowly, talking less than usual, as if something about the food encouraged quiet rather than urgency. Catherine felt useful in a way that did not demand explanation. Unbeknownst to her, a few streets away, another walk was unfolding. Brian Carter had developed a habit of evening strolls through the same park. It suited the image he liked to project. Controlled, thoughtful. Beside him walked Allison Grant, her presence carefully calibrated to match his pace. They spoke of plans and appearances, of what came next. It was Brian who heard the laughter first. He turned toward the sound and froze. Catherine stood near the water, feeding small pieces of bread to the ducks gathered along the edge. Beside her, Jacob laughed as the puppy barked excitedly, attempting to intimidate birds twice its size. Catherine looked healthy, relaxed, alive in a way Brian had not expected to see again. For a moment, Brian did not move. Shock passed quickly, replaced by calculation. He watched without calling out, without stepping closer. Allison noticed the change in his posture, followed his gaze, and understood immediately. Catherine never saw them. She left the park that evening with a lightness she had not felt in years. The world had not suddenly become simple or safe, but it had opened just enough to let her breathe. In that space, she felt something return quietly without ceremony. Joy, unannounced, had found its way back to her. Brian's disbelief did not last long. The shock of seeing Catherine alive, standing in the open sunlight of the park, gave way to something colder and far more familiar. His mind moved quickly, assembling assumptions with the efficiency he applied to every calculation. The diagnosis he had researched had promised no survivors, at least not without enormous expense. Specialized treatment, private centers, money. If Catherine was alive, then resources had been involved. Someone had paid. And if someone had paid, Brian reasoned, then Catherine either had money or had access to it. The thought lodged itself firmly in place. From that moment on, his attention drifted back to her, not as a person, but as an opportunity he might have abandoned too quickly. He replayed the past months with growing irritation, convincing himself that he had been misled, that she had withheld information, that she owed him clarity if not explanation. Allison Grant noticed the change immediately. Brian's questions became distracted. His routines shifted. He spoke Catherine's name casually, as if testing the sound of it again. Allison understood ambition well enough to recognize its twin when it appeared, insecurity. She did not confront him. She adjusted. Over time, she had gathered documents, quietly, without drama. Copies of financial irregularities Brian had dismissed as temporary shortcuts. Transactions he had justified as necessary. Paper trails that connected him to decisions his employer would not tolerate. She had never needed them before. Now, she brought them forward with careful timing. She did not threaten. She reminded. She spoke of loyalty, of shared futures, of protection. She made it clear that stability required cooperation. Brian listened. The shift was subtle but decisive. He stopped questioning. He deferred. His independence narrowed until his sense of security rested firmly in Allison's hands. Meanwhile, Catherine continued to rebuild her life without reference to him. Volunteering at a shelter kitchen began as an extension of habit. She knew food. She knew how to organize a space quickly and efficiently. The work was demanding but honest, the kind that left no room for pretense. She moved among volunteers, quietly, directing where needed, never announcing herself. It was there, amid the clatter of trays and the low hum of conversation, that she encountered Brian again. He stood near the entrance, hands clasped as if uncertain where to place them. The room felt smaller the moment she noticed him. But Catherine did not stop what she was doing. She finished plating, wiped her hands, and turned to face him only when necessary. Brian spoke first, his voice carefully neutral. He said her name as though it were a question. Catherine met his gaze without surprise. There was no anger in her expression, no fear, only distance. She acknowledged him politely, asked if he needed assistance, and waited. He attempted to speak of concern, of misunderstanding, of relief at seeing her well. The words sounded rehearsed, disconnected from their meaning. Catherine listened without interrupting, her attention already shifting back to the task at hand. When he finished, she responded simply. She told him that this was not the time or place, that her life had moved forward, that whatever he was searching for, it was no longer with her. Her tone remained even, devoid of accusation or invitation. Then she turned away. Brian stood alone, the conversation already over. Later that week, Catherine met Samuel Miller. He arrived at the shelter with his young daughter, moving cautiously through the room as though unsure of his welcome. He was quiet, reserved, his attention divided between his surroundings and the child at his side. The girl clung to him at first, watching others with wary curiosity. Samuel spoke little at first. He volunteered for practical tasks, listened more than he talked. Catherine noticed his competence immediately, the way he repaired a faulty outlet without drawing attention, the way he navigated the space without intrusion. Over time, she learned who he was. Samuel was Ruth Miller's son, estranged for years. Their separation had not been marked by a single argument, but by silence that had grown too large to cross easily. He worked where he could, avoided conflict, focused his energy on his daughter. His presence carried the weight of unfinished history. Catherine watched him interact with the child, saw the patience in his movements, the care he took to shield her from discomfort. The contrast between this quiet responsibility and the choices Brian had made was stark. In these moments, the difference between decay and strength became unmistakable. Brian continued to unravel under Allison's control, mistaking dependence for partnership. Catherine, by contrast, built quietly, piece by piece, without spectacle. She resisted not through confrontation, but through absence, through the steady refusal to be pulled backward into a life she had already outgrown. The paths before them had diverged completely. One narrowed by greed and fear, the other widened by restraint and resolve. And Catherine did not look back. The idea of the hidden cache stayed with Catherine long after Ruth first mentioned it. At first, she dismissed it as a fragment of memory, something shaped by time and pain rather than fact. But as Ruth's health stabilized and conversations deepened, the story returned with quiet insistence. Ruth spoke of an apartment she had once shared with a man she no longer named, of years marked by control, erasure, and a theft that had never been repaired. When Catherine finally asked if the cache was real, Ruth did not hesitate. She said it was. She said she had hidden it carefully during the final months before leaving. She said it contained proof of what had been taken from her. And she said she no longer had the strength to look for it herself. That was how Catherine found herself standing in Ruth's old apartment with Jacob and Samuel. The space was smaller than Catherine had imagined, shaped by the utilitarian efficiency of an older building. The furniture was dated. The walls bore faint outlines where pictures had once hung. Samuel moved through the rooms with visible tension, every step measured. This was his childhood home, preserved in fragments he had never meant to revisit. They searched methodically. Drawers were emptied, Cabinets opened. Loose floorboards checked. Jacob approached the task with quiet focus, while Catherine followed Ruth's descriptions as closely as possible. Samuel lingered near the edges at first, watching, then slowly joining in. Hours passed without success. Fatigue crept in, accompanied by doubt. Jacob suggested they take a break. Catherine was about to agree when Samuel stopped in the narrow hallway, his hand resting against the wall. He knocked once, lightly. The sound was wrong. Hollow. They worked together then, removing a section of the lower wall paneling that had been disguised to blend seamlessly with the rest. Behind it was a narrow cavity, sealed and untouched. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in plastic, yellowed with age but intact. Samuel's hands shook as he lifted it free. They did not open it there. Catherine insisted they take it to Ruth. The reunion that followed was quiet and unguarded. Ruth opened the door herself, leaning on the frame as Samuel stood before her. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ruth stepped forward and covered her face with trembling hands. Samuel crossed the space between them without hesitation, holding her as if the years of distance had never existed. Inside, the bundle was unwrapped carefully. What emerged was unmistakable. A patent document bearing Ruth's name, dates, signatures. Alongside it, handwritten notes and a full recipe. Proof that her ex-husband had stolen her work and sold it as his own. The theft had cost her recognition, income, and professional standing. It had also bound her to silence through fear. Ruth wept openly then, not from loss but from release. Jacob arranged for legal counsel through his company's connections. The process was deliberate but decisive. The patent was validated. Rights were restored. The company that had profited from the stolen work was forced to acknowledge the claim. Financial compensation followed. Enough to secure Ruth's future and return what had been denied to her. Samuel remained beside his mother through every step. Their reconciliation unfolded without speeches or demands. They spoke of the past when necessary, but more often focused on what remained. Shared meals, quiet evenings, the presence of Samuel's daughter, who quickly filled the space with questions and laughter. For Catherine, watching this healing felt deeply personal. Not long after, the idea of opening a cafe resurfaced. It began as a conversation, tentative and unpolished. Catherine spoke of wanting a space built on care rather than ambition. Ruth listened, offering insight shaped by experience rather than control. Jacob supported the logistics without pressing direction. When the cafe opened, it reflected all of them. The menu balanced Catherine's precision with Ruth's depth. The atmosphere was unpretentious, inviting people to stay without urging them to leave. Ruth worked when she felt strong enough, guiding rather than commanding. Catherine found herself standing in a place that felt earned, not borrowed. Justice, long delayed, had arrived quietly, and with it came something more enduring, a family restored, a future reclaimed, not through force or confrontation, but through patience, truth, and the courage to uncover what had been hidden for too long. Allison Grant learned she was pregnant on a gray Tuesday morning, sitting alone in a private clinic while the hum of fluorescent lights filled the silence. The news did not bring relief or joy. It brought calculation. She rehearsed the conversation before it happened, already sensing how it would end. Brian's reaction confirmed it. He listened without interrupting, his face unreadable, then asked practical questions that had nothing to do with her health. Timing, optics, complications. When Allison said she intended to keep the child, his tone cooled further. He spoke of inconvenience, of risk to his career, of how a pregnancy would complicate things. He suggested termination as if it were a scheduling adjustment. Allison refused. From that moment, the distance between them widened into something unbridgeable. Brian became increasingly absent, irritable, dismissive. When Allison's pregnancy developed complications and doctors ordered strict rest, he treated the instruction as an annoyance. And when premature labor began, sudden, painful, and frightening, Brian did not come. He claimed urgent meetings. He sent a brief text. He never showed up. Alone in the hospital, Allison endured the hours that followed with a clarity that hurt more than the physical pain. As doctors worked to stabilize her and the baby, she understood the truth she had avoided. Brian did not abandon people because of circumstances. He abandoned them because he could. Recovery gave her time to think. Allison had long known about Brian's off-book dealings, the falsified invoices, the quiet siphoning of funds from projects that relied on trust rather than scrutiny. At the time, she had treated that knowledge as leverage. Now it became something else. Responsibility. She gathered what she had. Documents, copies, records she had kept for her own protection. And when she was discharged, she made a decision she did not announce. She handed the evidence over. While consequences began moving quietly into place, Brian turned his attention back to Catherine. Seeing her alive and thriving had unsettled him more than he admitted. He convinced himself that her success had to be built on money she had hidden. He told himself that whatever she had gained should have been his. That belief hardened into fixation. Late one evening, after closing, Brian slipped into Catherine's cafe through a side entrance he knew from earlier visits. The space was empty, calm, and warm in a way that made him uncomfortable. He planted a small listening device beneath a desk in the back office, careful and methodical, as if he were restoring order rather than violating it. He waited. Catherine noticed the device the next morning. Jacob found it first, flagged by an alert from the cafe's security system. Catherine listened without surprise. She understood Brian's pattern too well to feel shocked. Instead of removing the device immediately, she chose to act. She staged a conversation. In the back office, within range of the device, Catherine spoke calmly about a supposed inheritance, money left to her by a distant relative, newly accessed, substantial enough to change everything. She expressed concern about keeping it quiet, about avoiding claims or interference, about protecting her investment plans. The words were chosen carefully. Brian took the bait. He arrived at the cafe unannounced that afternoon, his composure already cracked. The space was full, customers, staff, and familiar faces. Catherine's mother-in-law, Margaret Carter, sat near the window, invited earlier under the pretense of a family meeting. Allison was there too, pale but steady, her presence deliberate. Brian confronted Catherine loudly. He demanded explanations, accused her of deceit, claimed entitlement. His voice rose with every sentence, revealing more than he intended. He spoke of money that was not his, of waiting, of what he had planned to take. The room went quiet. Margaret stood slowly, her expression rigid with something colder than anger. She listened until Brian finished, until he realized he had no control left to regain. When she spoke, her voice carried. She said she had heard enough. She said she had watched him choose ambition over decency again and again. She said that any man capable of abandoning a wife in a hospital room and a pregnant partner in labor did not deserve to call himself her son. Then she told him what he had already lost. Her will had been revised, assets redirected, everything intended for him now secured for his child instead. Brian reached for protest, but there was nothing left to argue. Allison stepped forward next. She said nothing dramatic. She simply placed a folder on the table. Copies of documents, evidence already submitted. Brian recognized them instantly. His face drained of color as understanding caught up to him. Within weeks, the legal consequences unfolded. Investigations were opened. Accounts frozen. Brian was suspended, then dismissed. Charges followed, methodical and unrelenting. The narrative he had built for himself collapsed under its own weight. Catherine watched from a distance. She did not attend hearings. She did not comment publicly. Her role was finished. What remained was not revenge, but resolution. Karma had arrived not as spectacle, but as exposure. And nothing Brian had built survived the light. The investigation into Brian Carter moved forward without drama, but with precision. Accounts were audited. Contracts were reviewed. Statements were taken. What had once been whispered behind closed doors now existed in official language. Dates, signatures, intent. Brian attended hearings with a posture that suggested endurance rather than remorse. The outcome was not swift, but it was inevitable. Prosecution followed procedure, and the future he had built on shortcuts and entitlement dissolved into consequences he could not negotiate away. Margaret Carter did not visit him. Her attention turned instead to Allison and the child. Support was offered quietly. Medical care, housing, stability. There were no public reconciliations or forced forgiveness. Only a steady commitment to ensuring that the next generation would not inherit the same patterns. Allison accepted the help without pride or shame. Motherhood had clarified her priorities in a way nothing else ever had. Catherine watched these developments from a distance. Her life had grown full in a way that left little room for retrospection. The cafe became a living space rather than a project. Busy mornings, familiar faces, the rhythm of work that felt honest. Samuel proved invaluable, not only for his practical skills, but for his consistency. Trust grew from shared effort rather than promises. He became a partner in everything that mattered. Ruth worked when she wished, guiding without imposing, her presence anchoring the kitchen in experience rather than authority. Catherine often noticed how customers lingered, how conversations unfolded naturally. The place carried something intangible. Care, perhaps, that could not be replicated. Jacob changed, too. Weight fell away gradually, not through discipline alone, but through belonging. He moved differently, spoke with more certainty. The awkward pauses that once defined him softened into thoughtfulness. Success had always followed him. Confidence had not. Now, surrounded by people who valued him without expectation, he grew into himself. The proposal did not come with spectacle. One evening after closing, with chairs stacked and the lights dimmed low, Jacob asked Catherine if she would marry him. There were no speeches. She said yes without hesitation. They married at the cafe weeks later. The ceremony was small, almost incidental. Ruth stood nearby, smiling. Samuel brought his daughter, who scattered petals with careful seriousness. Margaret attended quietly, offering congratulations without reclaiming space. There was laughter. There was food prepared by hands that understood one another. No one spoke of the past. It was not forgotten. It was simply no longer central. Catherine stood behind the counter later that night, watching Jacob talk with guests, watching the life they had built settle into place. She felt no triumph, no desire to revisit what had been taken from her. What remained was enough. Dignity had not come from winning. It had come from choosing herself when it mattered most. For those listening, the truth of her story rested there. You are not defined by who abandons you at your weakest. Silence, chosen deliberately, can be a form of power. Healing does not require revenge, only clarity and courage. And perhaps the question to carry forward is a simple one. Where would you have drawn the line?